Hello, I'm Randall M. Rueff. If you remember, a few years ago, Jeff Foxworthy had this thing where he said, you might be a redneck, and then, gave some explanation. Well, I came up with a list of my own, and I thought, well, here I am. Let's put them on YouTube. So, here we go. I hope you enjoy, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. If the airspace over your house is banned by the FAA, you might be a redneck. If you're afraid to use a computer because you think the mouse might bite, you might be a redneck. If you think the Brady Bunch is something you can pick up at the grocery store, you might be a redneck. If you list thinking time as a tax deduction, you might be a redneck. If your pager or cell phone makes a burping sound, you might be a redneck. If you've ever given blood to raise money to make a car payment, you might be a redneck. If you refer to someone other than your spouse as your better half, you might be a redneck. If you take a picture of your family and the camera actually does break, you might be a redneck. If you think your VW Beetle sounds just as good as the Beatles, you might be a redneck. If you wear prescription glasses and you still can't pass the vision test at the Department of Motor Vehicles, you might be a redneck. If you have your telephone speed dial set to the Psychic Friends network, you might be a redneck. If you claim to eat but never swallow, you might be a redneck or a politician. If the highlight of the last decade was getting a tetanus shot from a pretty nurse, you might be a redneck. If you can walk faster than all of your other relatives drive, you might be a redneck. If you work at the post office and you're working very hard to get that promotion to stamp licker, you might be a redneck. If you refer to Forrest Gump as a superhero, you might be a redneck. If you're married to or know someone who is louder than the car stereo, you might be a redneck. If all of your relatives are related to you in the exact same way, you might be a redneck. If you think that in real life, the Wile E. Coyote could catch the Roadrunner, you might be a redneck. If you refer to Spam as a major food group, you might be a redneck. They say that a dog is a man's best friend. But if your dog is your best friend, literally, you might be a redneck. If you join the church choir and the choir leader teaches you sign language, you might be a redneck. If you have the sound of barnyard animals on your answering machine, you might be a redneck. If all of your pets are paper trained, but your kids still wet the bed, you might be a redneck. You go to work, show your boss a stupid pet trick you saw on David Letterman the night before in the hopes of getting a promotion, you might be a redneck. If your parents refer to Woodstock as just your average day, you might be a redneck. If the smartest person in your family has aspirations to move to New York City in the hopes of maybe someday becoming a New York City cab driver, you might be a redneck. If you think it's weird that not everybody else everywhere in the country uses a blowtorch to cook with, you might be a redneck. If you do a video for YouTube and use this as your background, you might be a redneck. If you keep the recipe for ice water in a recipe book, you might be a redneck. If you think Dr. Pepper is a legitimate medicine made by a doctor whose last name is Pepper, you might be a redneck. If you're working and have a job and are trying to raise money in the hopes of someday going to junior high, you might be a redneck. If you discover you can't put the sparks back into your love life with an arc welder the hard way, you might be a redneck. If your favorite musical instrument is the whoopee cushion, you might be a redneck. If you played the whoopee cushion in your high school's marching band, you might be a redneck. If you're planning to join the United States Navy in the hopes of finding a mermaid, you might be a redneck. If you've ever had to be cautious while crossing a bridge because of the weight of one of your relatives, you might be a redneck. If you feel sorry for Michael Jackson and just don't understand why he's having all the problems he's having these days, you might be a redneck. If you like to take naps under your favorite tree during a lightning storm, you might be a redneck. After coming to your house to pick up some items, Goodwill calls for backup, you might be a redneck. If you have next door neighbors who are talking about moving closer to the county landfill, you might be a redneck. If you understand what your dog or cat is saying just as well as you understand your spouse, you might be a redneck. If you think going to the mountain and collecting dew would be cheaper than buying it in the store, you might be a redneck. If you judge the quality of a restaurant based on whether the ketchup comes in a packet or in a pump, you might be a redneck.